Hello, this is Bob McClellan. In this screencast, I will demonstrate two methods for creating a pivot table using OpenXML. The example I will be showing is included in the PowerTools core source code that you can find at powertools.codeplex.com. Make sure you get version 2.2.2 or later. In a later screencast, I will be showing the details of how to create the XML for a pivot table, but in this I'm just going to show how to use the code that is in the PowerTools core. Here is the example program from that PowerTools core, and the first approach is to update an existing pivot table in a spreadsheet with new data. So here I have quarterly sales.xlsx, which is my existing spreadsheet, and I'm going to fill it in with data from pivotdata.txt. So let's look at those files to see how they're set up. Here's my spreadsheet that I have preset with a pivot table in it. Now this method requires that you know the general structure of your data. So I already have columns preset here, and I have set a named range on the columns and rows here. And then my pivot table has already been created as well based on those columns and so on, and in referring to that named range. So now this is a pretty simple but useful approach because the pivot table is already set up for you. And if you look at the code here, what I'm doing is opening up that spreadsheet and then reading from the text file and filling in the cells. The only thing that special kind of processing, I guess, that I need to do here is to determine what data type each of the items in that text file is. So if we look at the text file, you can see it's just a simple list of all the values I want in there. And so then I just check by doing the try parse on a double to see if it is numeric. If it is, then I set it as a number. Otherwise, it's set as a string. Then the last step here is to update the range end row, which is a method that I wrote in the PowerTools core code. And I'll just set that end row to the last row that I read in from my text file, and then I save the new document as quarterly pivot. So quarterly sales is the original, and quarterly pivot will be the new one. So I'm going to run this. Now we can look at the result. I have a new quarterly pivot. It has all the data in there from that text file. And when I go to the pivot table, I just have to tell it to refresh. And I get everything just the way I want it. So that's pretty useful. The advantages are that I can have all my columns set up. I can have the pivot table formatted the way I want. One of the disadvantages is that I have to refresh it, and that I have to have an original always around for this. This will fit some needs, but let's also look at the option of creating entirely from scratch. I'm going to use the same approach in creating from scratch. I'm going to use the same approach for filling out the data, but instead of opening an existing spreadsheet, I'm going to create an entirely new one, create a new sheet with the sheet name of range, and then it's the same code. So I'm filling in the entire text from pivotdata.txt And in this case, I'm going to have to set up a range. So I also am keeping track of the maximum column that it reads from there, so I'll know how to set my range. So this code is pretty much the same as above, with the addition of the max column, determining the type, and so on. Then a remarkably small amount of code at the bottom, because it's calling these functions in the PowerTools core. I'm going to set the range. This set range is looking for a range name, a sheet name. So my range name is sales, my sheet name is range. That's the sheet it's going to set it on, or apply to. And then I have my start and end rows and columns, which I've computed as I filled it in above. The next thing I'm going to do is add a worksheet for the pivot, and I call it pivot, and then the actual creating of the pivot table. And here I pass in the range name again, sales, so that has to match the set range call. And then pivot is the actual worksheet part, which was returned from add worksheet, so it'll know that that's the one where it's going to create the pivot table. And then I write out my new pivot. I save it. So let me look. Here's my new pivot. Now all my data is here again, and this is a brand new spreadsheet that didn't exist before. Now in this case, my pivot table is not set up at all, because that code didn't do anything to set up the columns. But I can go ahead and drag the parts I want, put an amount in there, put a category, let's say over here, and so on. Notice there's no formatting, but I can go over to my pivot table design and drop whatever formatting I want on there, adjust my column headings. And of course a lot of this stuff could be done in OpenXML, but it's quite complex, so I will leave that for either later work or for your own investigation. So that concludes this simple demonstration of how to create pivot tables using the methods in the PowerTools for OpenXML core code, and I hope you'll find that useful.